The year was 1857, and Dr. Heinrich Voss stood in his laboratory, surrounded by copper wires, glass tubes filled with mysterious liquids, and the acrid smell of sulfur. But what made this scene truly horrifying wasn't the bizarre contraptions scattered across his wooden tables. It was the small, pale figure lying motionless on the metal slab in the center of the room. His son Wilhelm had been dead for 3 days. Most fathers would have buried their child and mourned. Heinrich Voss was not most fathers. He was a brilliant inventor, a man who had devoted his life to understanding the mysteries of electricity and the human body. And now, driven by grief so profound it had twisted his mind into something unrecognizable, he was about to attempt the impossible. You see, Heinrich believed that death was nothing more than the absence of electrical current in the human body. If he could restore that current, if he could send the right amount of electricity through the right pathways, he could bring Wilhelm back from the dead. Tonight, as storm clouds gathered over the small German town of Heidelberg, he would put his theory to the ultimate test. What happened next would haunt the town for generations, spawn legends that would inspire Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and prove that some boundaries between life and death should never be crossed. This is the true story of a father's love that became an obsession, a scientist's curiosity that became madness, and an invention that would change our understanding of what it means to be alive forever. But to understand how Heinrich Voss became the man who would try to resurrect the dead, we need to go back to the beginning, to a time when electricity was still a mystery, when the line between science and magic was dangerously thin, and when a brilliant young man first discovered that the human body could be animated by the power of lightning itself. Heinrich Voss was born in 1822 in a small village outside Munich. His father was a blacksmith, his mother a seamstress, and from the very beginning, it was clear that Heinrich was different. While other children played with wooden toys, Heinrich dismantled clocks. While they chased butterflies, he captured beetles and studied their anatomy with a magnifying glass his grandfather had given him. By the age of 12, Heinrich had already built his first electrical device, a primitive battery made from copper coins and vinegar that could produce small sparks. His parents, simple folk who barely understood what their son was creating, watched with a mixture of pride and fear as he filled their home with strange contraptions and foul-smelling chemicals. When Heinrich turned 18, he left his village to study at the University of Munich, where he quickly distinguished himself as one of the most promising students in the natural sciences. His professors marveled at his understanding of anatomy, his intuitive grasp of electrical principles, and his ability to construct devices that seemed to defy the laws of nature. But it was during his 3rd year at university that Heinrich made the discovery that would change his life forever. While dissecting a freshly dead frog in his anatomy class, he accidentally touched the creature's leg with a copper wire that was connected to his electrical apparatus. The leg jerked violently, as if the frog was still alive. The other students gasped and stepped back, but Heinrich leaned closer, his eyes wide with fascination. He had just witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about life and death. If a dead frog could move when electricity was applied to its muscles, what else might be possible? That night, Heinrich stayed in the laboratory long after the other students had gone home. He worked feverishly, applying electrical current to various parts of the frog's body, watching as its legs kicked, its eyes opened and closed, and its mouth seemed to gasp for air. To anyone watching, it would have appeared that the frog had returned to life. But Heinrich knew better. The frog was still dead, its movements nothing more than muscle contractions caused by electrical stimulation. Still, the experience had planted a seed in his mind, a dark possibility that would grow and fester over the years to come. After graduating with highest honors, Heinrich moved to Heidelberg, where he established himself as both a respected physician and a pioneering researcher in the field of electrical medicine. He married Anna, the daughter of a local merchant, and for a time, his life seemed perfect. He had a thriving practice, a loving wife, and a reputation as one of the most innovative doctors in all of Germany. In 1853, Anna gave birth to their son, Wilhelm. Heinrich had never known love like what he felt for that small, perfect child. He would spend hours in the nursery, watching Wilhelm sleep, marveling at the miracle of life itself. The boy had his father's curious nature and his mother's gentle spirit, and Heinrich began to imagine all the discoveries they would make together, all the secrets of the natural world he would share with his son. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Wilhelm was barely 4 years old when he began showing signs of illness. It started with a simple cough, the kind that every child gets during the cold winter months. But this cough didn't go away. It grew worse, deeper, until the boy was struggling to breathe. Heinrich, despite all his medical knowledge, watched helplessly as his son's condition deteriorated. The local physicians called it consumption, the wasting disease that had claimed so many lives in 19th century Europe. There was no cure, no treatment, nothing that could be done except to make the child comfortable in his final days. But Heinrich refused to accept this diagnosis. He tried everything, every experimental treatment he could think of, every electrical therapy he had developed. He built special devices to help Wilhelm breathe, machines that would deliver measured doses of electricity to his chest muscles. He filled the boy's room with copper wires and glass tubes, turning it into a bizarre laboratory where science and desperation collided. Anna begged him to stop, to let their son die in peace, but Heinrich couldn't give up. He was convinced that if he could just find the right combination of electrical current and timing, he could cure his son. But on a cold February morning in 1857, Wilhelm drew his last breath. Heinrich held the small, still form in his arms, feeling the warmth slowly leave the little body, and something inside him broke. Not just his heart, but his mind, his very understanding of what was possible and what was right. As Anna wept beside him, Heinrich's grief transformed into something else entirely, an obsession. A mad certainty that death was not the end, that science could triumph over the natural order, that he could bring his son back from whatever dark place he had gone. The first thing Heinrich did was to refuse to let anyone take Wilhelm's body. He told Anna and the other family members that he needed time to prepare the boy for burial, that there were special procedures he wanted to perform. But Heinrich had no intention of burying his son. Instead, he carried the small body to his laboratory and placed it on a metal table he had constructed specifically for this purpose. For the next 3 days, Heinrich worked without rest, without food, without sleep. He consulted every book on anatomy he owned, every journal on electrical science, every text on the mysteries of life and death. He drew diagrams of the human nervous system, calculated the exact amount of electrical current needed to stimulate each major organ, and designed a complex network of wires and electrodes that would cover Wilhelm's entire body. Heinrich's plan was based on his understanding of what he called vital electricity, the electrical current that he believed flowed through all living things. He theorized that death occurred when this current was somehow interrupted or depleted, and that by restoring it artificially, he could bring the dead back to life. But Heinrich knew that the small amount of electricity he could generate with his laboratory equipment wouldn't be enough. He needed something more powerful, something that could deliver a massive surge of electrical energy all at once. He needed lightning. And so, on the night of February 23rd, as a tremendous storm approached Heidelberg, Heinrich made his final preparations. He had spent the day positioning copper rods on the roof of his house, connecting them with thick cables that ran down through the walls into his laboratory. He had attached dozens of thin wires to Wilhelm's body, each one precisely placed to stimulate a different nerve or muscle group. As the storm grew closer, Heinrich could feel his excitement building. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for his entire life. He was about to prove that death was not the end, that science could conquer the grave itself, that love could triumph over the ultimate enemy. The first lightning strike hit Heinrich's copper rods at exactly 11:27 in the evening. The electrical surge raced down through the cables and into his apparatus, which immediately began to spark and smoke. Heinrich watched in fascination as the current flowed through the network of wires attached to Wilhelm's body. And then, something miraculous happened. Wilhelm's eyes opened. Not slowly, not gradually, but suddenly, as if the boy had simply been sleeping and had suddenly awakened. Heinrich gasped and leaned closer, his heart pounding with joy and terror. The boy's chest was moving, rising and falling in a steady rhythm. His skin, which had been cold and grey, was beginning to regain its natural color. Wilhelm, Heinrich whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "Wilhelm, can you hear me?" The boy's head turned toward his father, and Heinrich saw something that made his blood run cold. Wilhelm's eyes were open, but they were not the warm, curious eyes of his son. They were blank, empty, like two pieces of glass reflecting nothing but darkness. Wilhelm's mouth opened, and a sound emerged that was unlike anything Heinrich had ever heard. It was not a word, not a cry, but something inhuman, something that seemed to come from the very depths of hell itself. The boy's body began to convulse, his limbs jerking in unnatural ways, his spine arching backward until it seemed it might snap. Heinrich realized with growing horror that he had made a terrible mistake. This thing on the table was not his son. It was something else, something that had taken Wilhelm's form but possessed none of his soul, none of his humanity. The electrical current had indeed animated the dead tissue, but it had not restored life. It had created something far worse. The creature that had once been Wilhelm began to sit up, its movements stiff and mechanical. It turned its head toward Heinrich, and he saw that its expression was not one of recognition or love, but of hunger. A terrible, insatiable hunger that seemed to emanate from every cell of its reanimated body. Heinrich tried to disconnect the electrical apparatus, but it was too late. The creature was moving on its own now, powered by some internal force that Heinrich's science could not explain. It climbed off the table and began to walk toward him, its small hands outstretched, its mouth opening and closing in that horrible, soundless scream. Heinrich backed away, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had done. He had violated the natural order, had crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed, and now he was faced with the consequences of his obsession, with the terrible price of trying to cheat death itself. But the creature was fast, faster than any 4-year-old child should be. It lunged at Heinrich with inhuman speed, its small fingers like claws, its teeth now sharp and yellowed. Heinrich fell backward, knocking over tables and equipment as he tried to escape from the thing he had created, the laboratory filled with the sound of breaking glass and crackling electricity. As Heinrich's apparatus began to malfunction, sparks flew from the copper wires, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air. But through it all, Heinrich could hear that terrible sound the creature was making, a sound that seemed to be calling to something dark and ancient. Heinrich managed to grab a heavy brass candlestick from a nearby table and swung it at the creature's head. The impact should have killed it, should have stopped whatever dark force was animating it. Instead, the creature simply staggered backward, black fluid oozing from the wound, and then kept coming. It was then that Heinrich realized the full horror of what he had done. He had not simply reanimated dead tissue, he had opened a door to something else, something that existed in the spaces between life and death. And now that door was open, and other things were beginning to come through. The shadows in the laboratory began to move on their own, reaching out with tendrils of darkness that seemed to be alive. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Heinrich's breath came out in visible clouds. The creature that had been Wilhelm was no longer alone. Other shapes were beginning to materialize in the corners of the room, shapes that had no business existing in the world of the living. Heinrich knew he had to act quickly. He grabbed a bottle of sulfuric acid from a nearby shelf and threw it at the creature. The acid hit its chest and began to eat through the reanimated flesh, but instead of screaming in pain, the creature seemed to smile. A horrible, knowing smile that suggested it was enjoying the sensation of its own destruction. That was when Heinrich understood the true nature of what he had created. This was not his son returned from the dead. This was something that fed on pain, on suffering, on the kind of anguish that had driven Heinrich to attempt his mad experiment in the first place. It was a creature born from grief itself, sustained by the very love that had motivated Heinrich to try to bring Wilhelm back. The other shadows in the room were growing stronger now, more solid. Heinrich could see faces in them, the faces of other dead children, other victims of disease and accident and violence. They were all reaching for him, all drawn by the same dark energy that had brought Wilhelm back to life. Heinrich realized that he had to destroy his creation before it could escape the laboratory and spread its corruption to the rest of the world. He had to find a way to close the door he had opened, to send these things back to whatever realm they had come from. But as he looked around his laboratory for something that might help him, Heinrich realized that the real horror was not the creatures surrounding him. It was the knowledge that he had done this to himself, that his love for his son had been twisted into something monstrous, something that threatened everything he held dear. The creature that had been Wilhelm took another step toward him, and Heinrich finally understood what he had to do. He reached for the main switch that controlled all the electrical equipment in the laboratory. The switch that would send a massive surge of power through every wire and cable in the room. If electricity had brought these things to life, then perhaps electricity could send them back to death. But Heinrich knew that the amount of power required would be enormous, far more than any human body could survive. He would have to sacrifice himself to undo what he had done. As the creatures closed in around him, Heinrich thought of Anna, of the life they had built together, of the future they would never have. He thought of Wilhelm, the real Wilhelm, the boy who had died in his arms just 3 days ago. And he thought of what that boy would say if he could see what his father had become. Heinrich's hand closed around the switch, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The creatures stopped moving, as if they sensed what was about to happen. The shadows retreated slightly, and even the thing that had been Wilhelm seemed to hesitate. "I'm sorry," Heinrich whispered, though whether he was speaking to his son, his wife, or the world itself, he couldn't say. "I'm so sorry." And then he threw the switch. The explosion that followed could be heard for miles around Heidelberg. Windows shattered throughout the town, and the very ground seemed to shake, as if the earth itself was rejecting what had been done. When the townspeople finally gathered the courage to investigate, they found nothing left of Heinrich's house but a smoking crater filled with melted metal and ash. Of Heinrich himself, there was no trace, no body, no bones, nothing that could prove he had ever existed. The only evidence of what had happened was a small notebook found buried in the rubble, filled with diagrams and calculations, and a single sentence written over and over again, in increasingly frantic handwriting: "Some doors should never be opened." The authorities declared it a tragic accident, the result of a dangerous electrical experiment gone wrong. Anna, driven mad by grief and the loss of both her husband and her son, was committed to an asylum, where she spent the rest of her days telling anyone who would listen about the terrible things her husband had done in the name of love. But the story didn't end there. In the months that followed, strange things began to happen in Heidelberg. People reported seeing a small figure walking through the streets at night, a figure that looked remarkably like Wilhelm Voss. Animals began to act strangely, refusing to enter certain areas of the town. And on stormy nights, when lightning filled the sky, residents swore they could hear the sound of a child crying, a sound that seemed to come from beneath the very ground itself. The local priest, Father Müller, began to suspect that something unholy had been unleashed in his town. He conducted his own investigation, interviewing witnesses and examining the site of the explosion. What he found convinced him that Heinrich Voss had not simply died in an accident. He had opened a gateway to something dark and terrible, something that still lurked in the shadows of Heidelberg. Father Müller tried to warn the townspeople, but they dismissed his concerns as the ravings of a superstitious old man. They preferred to believe that Heinrich had simply been a brilliant inventor who had made a tragic mistake. The truth, they felt, was far too horrifying to accept. But as the years passed, the strange occurrences in Heidelberg became impossible to ignore. Children began to disappear, always on stormy nights, always without a trace. Search parties would find their clothes, sometimes their toys, but never their bodies. And those who claimed to have seen the missing children reported that they looked different somehow, changed in ways that defied explanation. The story of Heinrich Voss and his attempt to resurrect his son spread throughout Germany and beyond. Carried by travelers and merchants who had heard whispers of the strange events in Heidelberg, the tale grew in the telling, becoming more elaborate and more terrifying with each retelling. Some said that Heinrich had succeeded in bringing Wilhelm back to life, but that the boy had become something monstrous, something that still stalked the earth in search of other children to add to its unholy collection. Others claimed that Heinrich himself had become a creature of the night, doomed to wander the world in search of a way to undo what he had done. But perhaps the most disturbing version of the story was the one told by a young writer named Mary Shelley, who had heard the tale during a visit to Germany in 1858. She was so affected by the story that she wrote her own version, calling it Frankenstein, and making it the centerpiece of what would become one of the most famous horror novels ever written. In Mary's version, the scientists succeeded in creating life from death, but the creature he created was driven mad by loneliness and rejection. It became a monster that terrorized its creator and everyone around him. A living embodiment of the dangers of scientific hubris and the terrible price of trying to play God. But those who knew the real story of Heinrich Voss understood that Mary's version was actually a sanitized, almost hopeful take on what had really happened. In her novel, the creature was capable of learning, of feeling, of redemption. The thing that Heinrich had created was nothing more than hunger and hatred given form. A plague that threatened to consume everything in its path. And in the darkest corners of Heidelberg, where the shadows were deepest and the night was coldest, some whispered that the threat was not over. That Heinrich's experiment had opened a door that could never be fully closed. That somewhere in the spaces between life and death, the creature that had been Wilhelm was still waiting, still growing stronger, still hungry for the living world. It had been denied the official records of what happened to Heinrich Voss end with his presumed death in the explosion that destroyed his laboratory. But the unofficial records, the stories passed down through generations of Heidelberg residents, tell a different tale. They speak of a man who loved his son so much that he was willing to risk everything to bring him back. And they warn of the terrible price of love that refuses to accept the natural order, of grief that transforms into obsession, of science that goes too far. Today, more than a century and a half later, the site where Heinrich's house once stood remains empty. The city has tried to develop the land several times, but each attempt has ended in failure. Workers report strange accidents, unexplained illnesses, and a feeling of overwhelming dread that makes it impossible to continue construction. Historians have tried to research the true story of Heinrich Voss, but they find that many of the records from that time have been mysteriously destroyed or lost. It's as if someone, or something, doesn't want the full truth to be known, as if there are secrets buried in the past that are too dangerous to uncover. But on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the wind carries the scent of sulfur and ozone, residents of Heidelberg still report seeing strange lights in the empty lot where Heinrich's house once stood. They describe flashes of electrical energy that seem to dance in the air, and shadows that move independently of any earthly source, and sometimes, just sometimes, they hear the sound of a child laughing. Not the innocent laughter of a happy child, but something else. Something that speaks of hungers that can never be satisfied, of desires that transcend the boundaries between life and death, of love that has been twisted into something unrecognizable. The story of Heinrich Voss serves as a warning about the dangers of refusing to accept loss, of allowing grief to consume us so completely that we lose sight of what makes us human. It reminds us that there are some boundaries that should not be crossed, some doors that should never be opened, some loves that can become more dangerous than hate. In the end, Heinrich Voss got what he wanted. He found a way to bring his son back from the dead, but what he discovered was that the thing that returned was not his son at all. It was something else entirely, something that wore Wilhelm's face but possessed none of his soul. something that existed only to feed on the very love that had created it. And perhaps that is the most terrifying lesson of all. That love, the emotion we consider most pure and noble, can, under the right circumstances, become the source of our greatest horrors. That the desire to protect and preserve can transform into something monstrous, something that threatens not just ourselves, but everything we hold dear. The story of Heinrich Voss and his attempt to resurrect his dead son has been told and retold for generations. It has inspired countless works of fiction, from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to modern horror films and novels. But beneath all the dramatization and embellishment lies a simple, terrifying truth. Sometimes the greatest monsters are not born from hatred or evil, but from love itself. And in the quiet moments, when we are alone with our grief and our desperate desire to hold on to what we have lost, we might ask ourselves, how far would we go to bring back someone we love? What boundaries would we cross? What prices would we pay? The story of Heinrich Voss suggests that some prices are too high to pay, that some boundaries exist for good reason, and that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to let go, even when every fiber of our being screams against it, even when it feels like it might destroy us. Because in the end, love is not about possession or control. It's about acceptance, about understanding that everything that lives must also die, and that trying to cheat death itself is not an act of love, but of selfishness. It's about recognizing that grief, no matter how profound, cannot be allowed to consume us so completely that we lose sight of what makes us human. Heinrich Voss learned this lesson far too late. His love for his son, pure and genuine as it was, became twisted into something that threatened not just his own soul, but the entire world. He opened a door that should have remained closed, and the consequences of that decision echo through the centuries. A reminder that some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, some powers too terrible to wield, but perhaps, in telling his story, in remembering the man who loved his son so much that he was willing to risk everything to bring him back, we can learn from his mistakes. We can understand that true love sometimes means acceptance, that the greatest act of devotion is not to hold on, but to let go, and that the dead, no matter how much we miss them, belong to a realm that the living cannot and should not enter. The laboratory's gone, the inventor is dead, and the creature he created has supposedly been destroyed. But the lesson remains, carved into the very stones of Heidelberg, whispered in the wind that blows through its empty streets, and remembered in the stories passed down through generations of those who witnessed the terrible price of love that refuses to accept the natural order. Some doors should never be opened, some boundaries should never be crossed, and some loves, no matter how pure their origins, can become more dangerous than the darkest hatred. This is the legacy of Heinrich Voss, the inventor who tried to resurrect his dead son using electricity. A legacy written in lightning and shadow, in grief and obsession, in the terrible understanding that the greatest monsters are not born from evil, but from love itself when it goes too far, and in the darkness of Heidelberg, where the shadows are deepest and the night is coldest, that legacy lives on. A reminder that death is not the enemy we think it is, but rather the final boundary that keeps us human, the last door that should never, ever be opened.